tried over those points. First, let us note wherein consists the clear historicity of Muhammad. 1. He is far down within the historic period. 2. His religion rose to far spread power and notoriety within a generation of his death, a far swifter development than that of Christism, so often described as miraculous. 3. He actually left written documents, and though these were certainly redacted, most of them have none of the well-known marks of late fabrication. 4. In virtue of the relation of Islam to Christianity, which had a body of sacred books and claimed a monopoly of truth, a fierce critical light played upon the new cult from the first days of its expansion beyond Arabia. 5. The accounts of the life of Muhammad are normally biographical, and, though not quite certainly true in detail, at no point typically mythical, save as regards the tales of marvels at his birth and in his infancy, wherein the record conforms to the normal mythopoeic practice of antiquity, seen in the biographies of Plato and Confucius as well as in those of Jesus, Moses, and the gods and demigods in general. Apart from these embellishments, and the tales of his intercourse with angels, he is born and lives and dies normally at known dates, works no miracles, makes no claims to divinity, is traceable long before his period of notoriety, is, in short, recognizable as a historic type of masterful fanatic. In every one of these respects his record differentiates sharply from those of Buddha and Jesus. Absolute date, of course, is not a decisive consideration. We believe in the historicity of certain Jews B.C., and disbelieve in the legend of William Tell, who is placed 1300 years later. But when we consider the environments in which Jesus and Buddha are supposed to have lived, it becomes clear that the possibilities of fable round such names are boundless. Of neither is it now pretended that he left a written word, for neither do critical scholars now claim that his immediate associates have left written accounts of him. In regard to both, it is admitted that many sayings are falsely ascribed to them. Instead, then, of letting the supposed historicity of Buddha plead for that of Jesus, we are led to ask whether the one is not as problematic as the other. 8. The problem of Buddhist origins. At the first critical glance into Buddhistic origins, the student becomes aware of a dilemma. The Buddha, we are told, delivered a teaching which, though it did not directly repudiate, yet ignored and treated as valueless the belief in deities, and the movement he set up was thus practically atheistic. Yet the legends of his own birth, and many of the narratives concerning his life, are in terms of the supernaturalist beliefs of both earlier and later times. As regards the birth legends, they are found to quadrate in large measure with those of the god Krishna, and at the same time to point to many of the myths of the Vedas, 1196, so that, whatever may have been the origin of the Buddhist movement, it must have been heavily overgrown with supernaturalism when the life of the founder was thus written. The conservative student naturally answers that, though such overlaying and perversion of the master's teaching did take place, he remains none the less a real person, and that the proof lies in the many narratives which represent him as speaking like any other mortal teacher. A critical study of the teaching, however, only doubles the dilemma. The accomplished and devoted English scholar who has done so much during the past 30 years to make known the documents of Buddhism to the Western world, has no misgivings as to either the historicity of Gautama or his personal establishment of the Buddhist movement in the fashion set forth by the narratives, but the expositor's own scholarly candor puts before us a dozen grounds for doubt. Every cause for skepticism that exists in the cases of Jesus and Moses exists here, with differences of degree. Firstly, the Buddha wrote nothing. Secondly, none of his disciples or contemporaries wrote of him. Thirdly, some of the documents that seem nearest in time to the alleged period of Gautama, such as the dialogues, are thoroughly factitious, and strike a student as the reverse of trustworthy, while others are admittedly literary creations, ascribing to the Buddha extemporaneous verses of a highly finished quality. Fourthly, much of the teaching put in his mouth is of a nature known to be current before his period. As to the nature of his teachings, the obscurity is equally great. It is not merely that they contain inconsistencies such as may be fallen into by any teacher, they are so disparate, so discursive, so various in their tone, purpose, and point of view, that a very short critical study reveals difference of source, time, and aim, and when we contemplate their metaphysic, their minuteness, their demand for leisurely attention and assimilation, we are at a loss to conceive how they could have set up a far-reaching popular movement in any country at any time. As little do we realize why they should have set up any religious society whatever. And the ordinary histories make the assertion without explaining the case. On the other hand, much of the earliest literature exhibits all the marks of doctrinary myth, this by the implicit admission of the scholars who stand critically but confidently for the historicity of the teaching Buddha. The books of the Sutta Pitaka profess to give, not merely the belief itself, but the belief as the Buddha uttered it, with an account of the time when, and the place at which, he uttered it. The Buddha's new method of salvation, his new doctrine of what salvation was, did not present itself to the consciousness of the early Buddhist community as an idea, a doctrine, standing alone, and merely on its own merits. In their minds it was indissolubly bound up with the memory of the revered and striking personality of him who had proclaimed it. 1197 Thus it lies on the face of the case that any narrative could find acceptance which was put in circumstantial form, and that for any doctrine whatever a narrative frame was invented as a matter of course. After the Dhamma, or collection of short scriptures in verse, had come into vogue, the members of the order were no longer contented to learn, and to understand the meaning of, the various rules of the Patimokkha, part of the Vinaya or rules of the order. A desire sprang up to have, for each of them also, a historical basis, to know the story of how the Buddha himself came to lay down the rule to his disciples. And it was only the brother who was properly acquainted with all this, who was accounted a real doctor of the law. 1198 Now, the Dhammapada is believed to be wholly compiled from previous books, and some of its best doctrines are avowedly ancient, as thus, hatred does not cease by hatred at any time, hatred ceases by love. This is an old rule. 1199 Here, then, we have the cult making its teaching God on the ordinary lines, describing him as supernaturally born, calling him the Blessed One, and visibly creating for the traditional teacher a flatly fictitious biography. At this early stage, then, Buddhism is seen making its Buddha, and in the act, instead of yielding support by analogy to the belief in the historic Jesus, it vividly suggests a similar process of construction in the case of Christism. We are thus far merely left asking what primitive Buddhism really was. 9. Buddhism and Buddhas. Our English guide, than whom no man knows more of Buddhism, gives us a definition. There can be little doubt but that the doctrines of the Four Noble Truths and of the Noble Eightfold Path, the foundation of the kingdom of righteousness, were not only the teaching of Gautama himself, but were the central and most essential part of it. 1200 The teachings in question are too well known to need quotation here. They are simply a formal and symmetrical statement of the rules of self-repression, by which the Buddhist is to attain the inward peace of nirvana, or deliverance from blind desires. Let us then assume that these teachings are for Buddhism primordial. What is there to prove that they are the utterances of one Gautama, the Sakya sage, and that his proclamation of them set up an order of disciples? The order, by all accounts, was one of mendicants. Either there were, or there were not, such orders in existence before the Buddhist. If not, we are to suppose that one man, by the simple proclamation of a certain set of quietist principles, calling for self-restraint without any painful self-mortification, induced numbers of men and women, many of them instructed, to take up a new way of life in a country not much given to changes or experiments, and through this host of disciples instituted an order that was to set a great mark on the history of religion. The unlikeliness of such a sudden growth will be generally granted, and indeed it is fully conceded, though this is rarely mentioned in the more popular accounts of Buddhism, that a Sangha or society of the kind was no new phenomenon in Buddha's day. 1201 There seem to have been many, and the Buddhist order avowedly copied their practices, according to Buddhist tradition, and we see no sufficient reason for doubting the correctness of the account. The monks of other, that is, non-Buddhistic sects, used to meet together at the middle and at the close of every half-month, and were accustomed then to proclaim their new teaching in public. At such times, the different sects found an opportunity of increasing their numbers and their influence. The Buddhists also adopted the custom of these periodical meetings, but confined themselves to meeting twice in each month. 1202 Our authorities argue indeed that the penitential practice of the Buddhist meetings seems 1203 to have been an original invention of the Buddhists themselves, but here we have on the one hand an avowal that the Buddhists invented notable usages not prescribed by the traditional founder, and on the other hand a failure to demonstrate that the Buddhist practice was not pre-Buddhistic. 1204 On the face of the case, the claim is distinctly improbable, in view of the other data. For the rest, the Jainist movement admittedly dates from the same period. Mendicant sages are recognized in the Buddhist books as common phenomena before Buddha, 1205, and the same kinds of rules of conduct seem to have been general, save that the Buddhist was not so painfully ascetic as some others. The Buddhist movement, then, was one on anciently familiar lines. What is more, the title of the Buddha, which means the enlightened, so far from making claim to a new departure, was an implicit acknowledgement of continuance in established ideals. In the Pali and Sanskrit texts, the word Buddha is always used as a title, not as a name. The historical Buddha is represented to have taught that he was only one of a long series of Buddhas who appear at intervals in the world, and who all teach the same system. After the death of each Buddha, his religion flourishes for a time and then decays, till it is at last completely forgotten, and wickedness and violence rule over the earth. Gradually then the world improves, until at last a new Buddha appears who again preaches the lost Dharma or truth. The names of 24 of these Buddhas who appeared previous to Gautama have been handed down to us. The Buddhavansa, or History of the Buddhas, gives the lives of all the previous Buddhas before commencing the account of Gautama himself, and the Pali commentary on the Jatakas gives certain details regarding each of the 24. 1206. The number and the names may very well be, as our historian argues, late inventions, but there can be no question as to the fact of the belief. An early tradition avows that, after the Buddha had made 60 converts in 3 months, sent them in different directions to preach and teach, and again converted the whole population of Rajagriha, the capital of King Bimbisara, he encountered a period of hostility, in which his disciples were ridiculed as preachers of a doctrine of depopulation. Appealed to by them for counsel, he advised them to say that the Buddha was only trying to preach righteousness, as former Buddhas had done. 1207. Even in the late commentary of Buddhaghosa on the dialogues of Gautama, the Blessed One is represented as exhorting his disciples to be earnest, because hard is it to meet with a Buddha in the world. 1208. So in the Dhammapada we have the text, a Buddha is not easily found. Wherever such a sage is born, the race prospers. 1209. And the name Bhagava, the Blessed One, is equally impersonal, the Buddhist traditions themselves telling of Gautama's discussions with Bhagava, Alara, and Udraka. 1210. Finally, in the 4th century of our era, there was certainly near to Sravastia a sect of Buddhists who rejected Gautama, reverencing only the 3 previous Buddhas, and especially Kasyapa, whose body they believed to be buried under one of the dagobas at which they, as well as the orthodox, worshipped, while another was said to be built over the spot where he had died. 1211. There were probably current, then, at and before the time of Gautama's alleged teaching, any number of teachings credited to the Buddha and the Blessed One, and these might include many afterwards ascribed to Gautama. Given, then, an absolute absence of evidence for the transcription of any teachings of Gautama in his lifetime, on what grounds are we to believe that they were with knowledge ascribed to a man of that name, whose life answered to the non-supernatural details given in the legends? Nay, seeing that even the name Gautama or Gautama is on the one hand a common one, 1212, and on the other hand, as Gautama of the race of Gautama, full of mythological associations, 1213, and seeing further that there was admittedly another Gautama known to the early Buddhists who also founded an order, 1214. What proof is there that sayings and doings of different Gautamas may not have been ascribed to one person? On the view, again, that the 4 Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path are the oldest doctrines of the Buddhist movement and were formulated by one Gautama, what reason is there to believe that the movement either A. arose or B. made any progress on the simple basis of those teachings? Bauer, believing in the historicity of the Gospel Jesus, yet makes the avowal, how soon would everything true and important that was taught by Christianity have been relegated to the series of long-faded sayings of the noble humanitarians and thinking sages of antiquity, had not its teachings become words of eternal life in the mouth of its founder? 1215. Similarly may we not ask, how, in much-believing India, could any large organized movement develop on the simple nucleus of a teaching of self-control, which differed from the common practice of Hindu asceticism only in its renunciation of positive self-maceration? Nay, supposing a sage to have framed an eightfold path of right belief, right aims, right speech, right actions, right means of livelihood, right endeavor, right mindfulness, right meditation, how should he intelligibly proceed to establish his way by forming an order of mendicants? 1216. Our guide himself explains that these classified statements of moral truth were addressed to Brahmins skilled in the dialectics of the time, and they certainly have that aspect. But why should they be offered as a primary code for a new mendicant order? It will doubtless be answered that such a priori objection is unwarranted, that we must take the evidence as we find it and recognize as the primary teaching of the founder of Buddhism the doctrines repeatedly ascribed to him in the oldest documents. But when we inquire historically into the oldest documents and their authenticity, we learn from our leading instructors that the received tradition of the first Buddhist council, which collected the sayings of the master, is proved to be late and untrustworthy by an early sutta, which gives all the story of the heresy that is historically stated as the motive for the council, but says nothing of such a council taking place. The author of the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, says Dr. Oldenburg, did not know anything of the first council, and Professor Rhys-Davids agrees. 1217 And this very sutta, the book of the great decease, is open to suspicion of lateness, inasmuch as it makes the Blessed One figure at the head of a great movement in his lifetime, traveling sometimes with 500 and sometimes with 1250 disciples. What is more, it represents him as giving forth a kind of teaching hard to reconcile with other doctrine ascribed to him as typical, for in the very first chapter of the sutta, section 4, he is made to lay it down as one of the conditions of the permanent prosperity of a certain tribe of Vajans that they honor and esteem and revere and support the Vajan shrines in town or country, and allow not the proper offerings and rites, as formerly given and performed, to fall into desuetude. 1218 It may well be said of such a teacher that, so far from having opposed Hinduism and destroyed a system of iniquity and oppression and fraud, he lived and died a Hindu. 1219 But does such doctrine correlate with the denial of the permanence of the gods, and of the value of prayers and sacrifices, also ascribed to the Buddha by tradition and documents? The traditional First Council, then, which figures as the first historical authority for the existence of the Buddha's teachings, is later, if it ever took place at all, than a sutta which ascribes to him a teaching wholly different in spirit and aim from those commonly held to be typical and essential in his doctrine. But indeed Pali scholars are more and more convinced that the First Council is a mere literary myth, to assign to which a historical date is to put a false problem. 1220 And if the First Council thus goes by the board, of what value is the late tradition that the Council of Vesali was held 100 years after the Buddha's death? Our authorities argue that since the 10 points, said to have been there vehemently discussed, are not mentioned in the earlier sections of the Mahavagga, these must be prior to the Council, and that as the Patimokkha is visibly older still, the last named section of the Vinaya must be very old indeed. 1221 The answer is, 1. That the Council of Vesali 1222 may have been centuries later than the date traditionally assigned to it, and, 2. That the Vinaya texts in general, if relatively old, have nothing of the character of an innovating propaganda, nothing of the nature of an appeal which would create a new order, but rather correspond to the late code of rules framed for monastic orders in Christendom 1,000 years after the foundation of the Christian cult. The fact that they are all ascribed to the founder is but one more evidence of the total lack of the critical or historical sense among the members. 10. The Buddhist Cruces. Looking, then, for a foothold among the shifting sands of Buddhist tradition, we note the following clashing records. 1. The Buddha is represented alike in ostensibly early and in late tradition as speaking of the gods, with full belief in their existence. 1223 2. He is represented on the one hand as discouraging sacrifices, 1224, and on the other hand as prescribing for a whole tribe a strict adherence to ancient rites. 1225 3. King Asoka, who figured as a good Buddhist in the early vigor of the movement, about 250 B.C., habitually called himself the delight of the gods, as did his contemporary the pious Buddhist king of Ceylon, 1226 4. The Buddha is represented as throwing his order open to all classes, and at the same time as making the name Brahmin a term of honor for his arahats or saints. Brahmins, too, are said to have been among his most distinguished disciples, and the dialogues represent his conversations with them. 5. Much teaching that certainly did not come from Buddha is admittedly ascribed to him, the principle being that he delivered the whole canon. 6. Much philosophic matter set forth as his teaching is nearly identical with much of the Sankhya system, of which at least the germs are admittedly pre-Buddhistic. 1227 The last two circumstances are fully acknowledged by our Buddhist scholars. Oldenburg writes, I have essentially modified my previous skepticism in regard to the connection of the two systems, and seen reason to place Buddhism considerably closer to the Sankhya than my former researches suggested. 1228 And Professor Rhys-Davids, enumerating the long list of advantages claimed by the Buddha in one of the dialogues for the life of a recluse, concedes that it is perfectly true that of these 13 consecutive propositions, or groups of propositions, it is only the last, number 13, which is exclusively Buddhist. 1229 The exception being the realization of the Four Truths, the destruction of the asavas, lusts, errors, and ignorance, and attainment of arahatship. Professor Davids goes on to make the claim, but the things omitted, the union of the whole of those included into one system, the order in which the ideas are arranged. All this is also distinctively Buddhist. This claim, however, does not affect the significance of the admission, and is itself provocative of a new pressure of criticism. For if the exclusively Buddhist section be the last of all, is not the fair presumption this, that the Buddhist formula here has merely been added to an existing doctrine, appropriated by Buddhists? Among the specified rules of conduct admitted to be not exclusively Buddhist are many that go far to constitute the content of the Eightfold Path, which is thus obviously but a separate classification of precepts or ideals common to other schools. The same question arises again over the admission 1230 that the Eightfold Path is not mentioned in our sutta, the Samanaphala, and that, as regards 3 of the 4 lines of ethical precept to be traced in the teaching under notice, Buddhism in the first goes very little beyond the current ethics of the day, in the second and third proceeds mainly on the practice of pre-Buddhistic recluses and orders, and only in the fourth, specifying the Buddhistic program for arahatship, takes up a special stand. 1231 But on analysis it is found that this accepted doctrine is at most only verbally special to Buddhism, since the other schools also certainly profess to put down lust of life and physical pleasure, error, and ignorance, and it is not pretended that the word arahat was a Buddhist monopoly. The further we go, the stronger becomes the stress of doubt. Where we are not certainly dealing with pre-Buddhistic doctrine under the form of dialogues held by the Buddha, we are reading, as in so many passages of the Dhammapada, sayings of a literary construction, often in verse, which in their present form come from Buddhistic writers long after the alleged period of Gautama, though they too may derive from remote antiquity. Among these, even as happens in the later sections of the Christian Gospels, are some of the noblest ethical teachings of Buddhist literature. What doctrines, then, were special to Buddhism? Not karma, that was common property, shared in by Buddhism. 1232 Wherein did it ethically innovate? Not in asserting the superiority of a right mind to sacrifice, that was a primary doctrine of the Jainas, and admittedly pre-Buddhistic both within and without the pale of Brahmanism. 1233 Not in seeking a way of salvation independently of the Vedas, that had been done by many teachers, in various sects. 1234 Not in the doctrine that defilement comes not from unclean meats, but from evil deeds and words and thoughts, that is given by the Buddhist writers as pre-Buddhistic, being one of the few passages in which sayings of previous Buddhas are recorded. 1235 Not in the search for peace through self-control and renunciation, that was the quest of a myriad recluses, the goal of all previous Buddhas. Not in the view that there is a wisdom higher than that attained by mere austerities, that too is pre-Buddhistic. 1236 Not in the doctrine that non-Brahmins could join an order and attain religious blessedness, the other orders were equally open to men of low social status or even slaves. 1237 And indeed the rigid ideal of caste separateness was not yet established in the days or in the sphere of early Buddhism. 1238 For though Brahmin claims had long been exorbitantly high, it appears that there were many Brahmins who rationally waived them, and as regards ascetics they were not raised, or at least not pressed. 1239 In Buddhist practice, too, as in that of the early Christians, runaway slaves were not received into the order. 1240 As little was the admission of women to the order a Buddhist innovation, that too was practiced by the Jainas, and even the tradition makes the Buddha accept it reluctantly, in the 25th year of his preaching. 1241 There seems, in short, to be nothing on the face of the doctrine to account for the special expansion of the Buddhist movement. 1242 11. Sociological clues. Seeking for sociological explanations, we first turn to the economic conditions. As was to be expected, there are clear traces of an economic pressure that drove men into the order. In the Milinda Prashnaya, Questions of Mananda, Nagasena, the founder of the Madhyamaka school of northern Buddhism, in answer to a question from Milinda, the Greek king of Sagala in the Punjab 1243 as to whether all members join the order for the high end of renunciation, is represented as answering, certainly not, sire. Some for these reasons, but some have left the world in terror at the tyranny of kings. Some have joined us to be safe from being robbed, some harassed by debt, and some perhaps to gain a livelihood. 1244 Nagasena himself, again, is made to say that he joined as a mere boy, seeking to be taught. 1245 This account would in all likelihood hold good of the social conditions before the Greek invasion, and on the face of the case there is no difficulty in understanding that any order which secured men a measure of peace and security would find adherents, even as did the monasteries and monkish orders of the Middle Ages in Europe. But the same pressure would send applicants to other orders as well as the Buddhist, and we have still to ask why it was that the Buddhist was specially sought, and became specially powerful, as well as how it began. To begin with, there are strong reasons for regarding the Jainas and Buddhists alike as having been originally either simple sects, or sections of one sect, of Brahmanism, and as this view is held by two leading authorities, Weber and Jacobi, and is, as we have seen, now partially yielded to by Oldenburg, we may reasonably try it as a working hypothesis. Weber goes so far as to assert categorically, 1. That Brahmanic speculation anciently sundered on two main lines, one finding the first cause in indiscrete matter, the other finding it in spirit, 2. That the latter theory gradually became the orthodox one, and 3. That, from among the adherents of the former view, which came by degrees to be regarded as heterodox, there arose, as thought developed, enemies still more dangerous to orthodoxy, who before long threw themselves into practical questions also, and eventually became the founders of the form of belief known to us as Buddhism. 1246 On this view, which, it will be seen, implicitly modifies all the ordinary assumptions as to the origin of Buddhism in one man's teaching, the quasi-atheistic element in Buddhism is primordial, and the popular development is a mere sequel of a movement originally, as it were, academic. In Weber's opinion, the Jainas in turn are only one of the oldest sects 1247 of Buddhism, Buddha being for him a real personage who propounded to the people without distinction of caste a teaching in which there was absolutely nothing new, but which had previously been the possession of a few anchorites, and had never before been freely and publicly proclaimed to all. Hence, the enormous success that attended his doctrine. The oppressed all turned to him as their redeemer. 1248 Jacobi on the other hand, pointing to the ancient protest of the Brahmanic rite of Vasistha 1249 against the neglect of the Veda by ascetics, concludes that the germ of dissenting sects like those of the Buddhists and the Jainas was contained in the institute of the fourth asrama grade, and that the latter was the model of the heretical sects. Therefore Buddhism and Jainism may be regarded as religions developed out of Brahmanism, not by a sudden reformation, but prepared by a religious movement going on for a long time. 1250 For this view of the two sects as merely cognate there are various grounds, for instance this, that while both Buddhists and Jainas have adopted the 5 vows of the Brahmanic ascetics, the Buddhists opposed the Brahmanic doctrine of the Atman or personal soul, and the Jainas accepted it with modifications, holding that all parts of the elements, as well as animals and plants, have souls. This and various other details suggest rather an original independence than a splitting off. And Jacobi confidently claims 1251 that, we know for certain that Buddha at least addressed himself chiefly to the members of the aristocracy, and that the Jainas originally preferred the Kshatriyas, the warrior caste, to the Brahmins. 1252 Thus far, it will be seen, both forms of the theory accept broadly the tradition as to Buddha's preaching, though that tradition, as apart from the incidental revelations in the documents, says nothing of an acceptance of a Brahmanic basis by Buddha for his order, and Weber leaves his conception far from clear, inasmuch as he speaks at one time of a body of heretics as the founders of Buddhism, and at another of Buddha as one of its representatives, and as the first to publish broadcast doctrines previously confined to a few anchorites. And when we come to compare the legend of Buddha with the Jaina legend of Mahavira, the great hero, our difficulty deepens. The Jaina legends refer the preaching of Mahavira exclusively to the same district which Buddhism also recognizes as its holy land, and in Weber's opinion they display so close an affinity to the accounts of Buddha's ministry that we cannot but recognize in the two groups of narratives merely varying forms of common reminiscences. 1253 But, if reminiscences, why are they to be held as being primarily Buddhistic? And why, above all, are they to be certificated as reminiscences? Mahavira is actually described as son of Siddhartha, a name of Buddha, and husband of Yasoda, the name of the mythic nurse of Krishna. 1254 The Jainas, says Jacobi, have reproduced the whole history of Krishna, with small variations, in relating the life of the 22nd Tirthakara, Arishtanami, who was a famous Yodava. 1255 In the same way the Buddhists have put much of the history of Krishna into their stories of Buddha. Such adaptation is, in fact, a normal religious practice, common to many races and cults. 1256. A somewhat better reason than any Weber gives for regarding the Jaina legends as the later is that according to them Mahavira did 12 years penances as against Buddha's 6, was convinced of their necessity, and persevered in some of them after becoming a Trivikara or prophet. 1257. Such a comparison is avowedly post-Buddhistic. But such a detail might be added to an established Jaina legend just as the Buddhists undoubtedly added to theirs. Granting, however, that the Jainas may represent a secession from the Buddhist movement, their greater asceticism, involving a measure of uncleanliness 1258, being on the lines of the schism said by the Buddhist tradition to have been set up by Gautama's cousin Devadatta, 1259, identified by Jacobi with Mahavira, we have really no sound ground for believing that on either side we are dealing with facts in the life of any sect founder. The Buddhist legend runs that Ajatasattu, son of the Buddhist Raja Bimbisara, was induced by Devadatta to kill his father, Devadatta, at the same time causing 3 attempts to be made on the life of Buddha. Such a tale is on all fours with the efforts of the early Christians to make out that certain rival cults, such as that of Simon Magus, were set up by way of schism from Christianity, when in reality those cults were the elder. 1260. Jacobi puts it that Ajatasattu killed his father and warred on his grandfather, who was uncle of Mahavira and patron of the Jainas, thereafter siding with their rivals the Buddhists, whom he had formerly persecuted as friends of his father's. 1261. Here we have apparently one more attempt to draw a truth of history from a bare tradition, and on the principles followed in this inquiry there is no scientific warrant for such extraction. But there is on the other hand a clear scientific value in the suggestion that monarchic or other political forces may have determined the success of a particular order at a particular time. 1262. 12. Buddhism and Asoka. When Buddhism first emerges in what may be termed the light of history, it is as an established system highly favored by the great king Asoka, about 250 B.C. It is made clear by his edicts that only a small number of scriptures, whose titles are only partially identifiable with known extant writings, were then recognized as preserving the spoken discourses of the Buddha. 1263. And among those named is the terrors of the future, which seems to be a description of the different worlds of purgatory, one of which is described in the Pt.3, the 7th book of the 5th division of the 2nd Pitaka. So that thus early in the known history of the order it figures as holding in Buddha's name one of the common superstitions which Buddha is supposed to have repudiated. And Asoka, as we have seen, called himself the delight of the gods, as did his friend the contemporary Buddhist king of Ceylon. The first sociological problem is to account for the favor shown by such kings to such an order. Constantine, we know, raised up Christianity to be the state cultus because of its obvious political uses as a far-reaching organization, easily attachable to his interest. Had the kings of Magadha a similar motive? Chandragupta, according to both Greek and Hindu accounts, 1264 began his career as a robber chief in the time of Alexander, whose camp he had visited on the banks of the Hyphasis, as a defeated rebel, and after seizing the throne of Nanda, the murdered Raja of Magadha, about 315 B.C., he defeated Seleucus, the Greek governor of the Indus provinces, driving the Greek power out of India. If then, it is clear that it was just when Chandragupta and his low-caste followers from the Punjab came into power that the Buddhists, the party of reform, the party who made light of caste distinctions, began to rise rapidly in numbers and influence. 1265. It is quite intelligible that the upstart dynasty found in the moral and didactic influence of such an order a useful political support, as Ajatasattu may have done earlier, supposing him to have attained power by killing his father. The record that Ajatasattu, after favoring the Buddhists, captured Sravasti, their headquarters, and totally destroyed Kapilavastu, their sacred place, 1266, tells further of friction and complications, all presumably of a political character. Usurpers in such cases would be apt to have arrayed against them the influence of the Brahmins, and the midway position of the Buddhists, who at once paid respect to Brahmanism and departed from its caste principles, would place them in a certain imperfect measure of harmony with the illegitimate monarch. 1267. But there is a further reason for ascribing to Chandragupta a decisive influence on Buddhism in its relation to Brahmanism. If Weber is right, the peoples of the Punjab never submitted to the Brahmanical order of things, but always retained their ancient Vedic standpoint, free and independent, without either priestly domination or system of caste. For this reason, too, they were the objects of a cordial hatred on the part of their kinsmen, who had wandered further on, and on this account also Buddhism gained an easy entrance among them. 1268 But if Chandragupta with his Punjabis accepted Buddhism, they would be strengthening the tendency existent in Buddhism to ignore caste, and, again, we have it from the same authority that Buddha's teaching was mainly fostered in the district of Magadha, which, as an extreme border province, was perhaps never completely Brahmanized. 1269 So that the native inhabitants always retained a kind of influence, and now gladly seized the opportunity to rid themselves of the Brahmanical hierarchy and the system of caste. 1270 This view, it will be observed, diverges essentially from the other proposition, above cited, that Buddha in person undermined the principle of caste in a fashion altogether novel and unwonted. If caste had never at all been recognized in the Punjab, and had never triumphed in Magadha, there would be nothing very novel there in the teaching that personal salvation did not depend on it. For such a teaching, Oldenburg avows, there was not only no necessity in that age and environment, but there was no inclination. Any thought of any reformation of social conditions, Staatsleben, any notion of the founding of an earthly ideal kingdom, a pious utopia, was wholly alien to these early Buddhistic circles. Anything like a movement of social change was unknown in India. In short, the conception of Buddha as a kind of popular liberator is rejected by one of the leading scholars who still stand for the historicity of Buddha. 1271 And though Brahmanists of Sankhya leanings were presumably not great sticklers for caste to begin with, it may well have been the anti-caste bias of the Punjabis that first gave the Buddhist order a marked leaning of that kind, and supplied the basis for the belief that the founder had been a Kshatriya. Such a state of things, too, would perfectly account for the fact that the Buddhist scriptures were, and remain, composed not in Sanskrit but in the popular idiom. 1272 It only needed that a beginning should be made, to stamp a given language as the sacred tongue of Buddhism. What Ajatasattu presumably began and Chandragupta some generations later carried further, the grandson of the latter, Asoka, consummated. He found the Buddhist order flourishing, and fully established it through his extensive kingdom, not, however, in direct opposition to Brahmanism, with which the now firmly seated dynasty would naturally make terms of mutual accommodation. For him, it seems clear, Buddhism was an organization rather than a religion. It was compatible with Brahmanism while capable of being used to keep Brahmanism in check, and the delight of the gods was not concerned with its atheistic philosophy. 1273 Reverence towards Brahmins and members of the order was impartially prescribed in his edicts, and he repeatedly stipulates for an equal toleration of all sects, and an abstention all round from detraction of others. 1274 He was thus a Buddhist only in the sense that he made use of all organizations alike, and it is even doubtful whether he assimilated with more than a section of the Buddhists of his time. 1275 Nor is there any clear warrant for the conclusion that Buddhism in the time of Asoka was still comparatively pure, because in the edicts, we hear nothing of metaphysical beings or hypothetical deities, nothing of ritual, or ceremonies, or charms. 1276 Edicts were not the natural place for such allusions, but the mention of the treatise on the terrors of the future is surely significant enough. 1277 The Mahavansa tells that under the sun of royal favor, heretics assumed the yellow robe in order to share in its advantages. Whenever they had opinions of their own they gave them forth as doctrines of the Buddha. 1278 In that case they were doing what other Buddhists had done before them, and it is certain that most of what Buddhists accept as Buddha's teaching was penned long after Asoka's time. We thus reach a critical conception of Buddhist origins. The teaching Buddha, considered as the wondrous sage who in his lifetime creates by his own influence a great movement and establishes a great order, shrinks in the light of criticism to the vanishing point. The early suspicion of a keen scholar 1279 that, after all, Sakya Muni is an unreal being, is justified on the closest scrutiny. The order, probably originating among ascetic Brahmins, who may have been led to rationalism as a result of their primary renunciation of the Vedas, 1280 becomes intelligible simply as a monastic or mendicant sect on the ordinary Brahmanical basis, but tolerant on the subject of caste to start with, and tending to diverge from Brahmanism in doctrine and practice in the ratio of its numerical success, especially as regards its rejection of caste distinctions, a course obviously conducive to its expansion. On these lines, however, it could take many Brahmins with it, and inasmuch as it was primarily an order living under rules, rather than a school of doctrine, it could all along include ordinary believers in the gods as well as rationalists who turned their backs on official and popular Brahmanism because of its systematic exploitation of superstition. but to an energetic rationalism in such an order there was a fatal obstacle in the central principle or datum of the cult, the obtrusion of the supernatural Buddha as the source of all true wisdom. The very thinkers who framed the dialogues and discourses in which the Buddha most rationally teaches by argument were there building up the belief in a supernatural being in whom they themselves cannot have believed. To change the familiar phrase, they literally builded worse than they knew. On the popular craving for a teaching God they relied for securing the popularity of their order, and they thus frustrated the high aims of their doctrine, inasmuch as superstition always drives out judgment. By the admission of Professor Rhys Davids, the Northern Buddhists took a step, far removed from Gautama's doctrines, the step from polytheism to monotheism. But, on the other hand, they built up, on Brahmanic lines, a new Buddhistic polytheism, according to which there are 5 Dhyani Buddhas, mystical and divine beings, living in bliss, with 5 Bodhisattvas, or Buddhas elect, destined to be born, and 5 Manushi or human Buddhas, of whom Gautama is the 4th, the 5th, Maitreya, the Buddha of love, being still to come. And for all such creations we have the sufficient explanation that the dreamers craved after Buddhist gods to fill the place of the dead gods of the Hindu pantheon. And the Northern Buddhism, finally, is as completely given over to polytheistic superstition as the Southern. 1281 It may, indeed, have been the higher intelligence of the rationalizing Buddhists that secured the special success of their order, as compared with that of the Jainas, whose bias to systematic self-mortification, as well as their greater superstition, accounts for the unintellectual character of their literature. The less ascetic Buddhists would at once be better able to propitiate kings and better able to attract recruits. Among them would circulate such maxims as that in the Dhammapada, not nakedness, not plaited hair, not dirt, not fasting, or lying on the earth, not rubbing with dust, not sitting motionless, can purify a mortal who has not overcome desires. He who, though dressed in fine apparel, exercises tranquility, is quiet, subdued, restrained, chaste, and has ceased to find fault with all other beings, he indeed is a Brahmana, an ascetic, a friar, bhikshu. 1282 But behind such sane maxims stood forever the fabulous figure of the Buddha, the giver of all the wisdom in his order, and the imposer of all its artificial rules. Instead of the mass of myths concerning him being a late accretion to a body of high ethical teaching purporting to come from a normal human being, it is now seen to be probable that, as is contended by M. Senart, the mythical figure was there first, 1283, and the ethical teaching grew up fortuitously around it, even as the gospel teachings in all likelihood grew up round the name of a sacrificed Jesus who for his earlier worshippers was merely a name. To this, our initial problem, we now finally return, prepared to appreciate aright the issues. 13. The Buddha Myth. In the introduction to M. Senart's essay Sur la Legende de Buddha, the most comprehensive and scientific attempt of the kind yet made, the central problem is thus posited, either the historical data are the primary nucleus and as it were the central source, the legendary elements representing an ulterior action, in part accessory, without necessary cohesion, or, inversely, the mythological traits form a whole connected by a higher and anterior unity with the personage on whom they are here grafted, the historical data, if there are really any, being associated with them only in virtue of a secondary adaptation. It is at the first point of view that the inquiry has stood up to the present time. There has been drawn the practical conclusion that it suffices to suppress all the incredible details, what is left being taken for accredited history. I seek to show that for this first point of view we ought decidedly to substitute the second, 1284. The conclusion to which the present argument points is exactly this, adhered to, however, more strictly than is the case in M. Senart's admirably learned treatise. For while he thus seems to imply that the supernatural element is the beginning of Buddhism as such, he finally assumes that there actually was a founder. Certainly he sufficiently attenuates his conception, a sect has a founder, Buddhism like every other. I do not pretend to demonstrate that Sakyamuni never existed. The question is perfectly distinct from the object of this treatise. It follows, certainly, from the foregoing researches that hitherto the sacred personage has been given too much historical consistence, that the tissue of fables grouped around his name has been too facilely transformed, by arbitrary piecings, into a species of more or less unplausible history. Skepticism acquires from our analyses, in some regards, a greater precision. Still, it does not follow that we should indefinitely extend its limits. In this epic and dogmatic biography, indeed, there remain very few elements which sustain a close examination, but to say this is not to say that among them there has not entered some authentic reminiscence. The distinction is certainly very difficult. Where we are not in a position to show for a tradition its exact counterpart in other cycles, a decision is an extremely delicate process. All that is suspicious ought not necessarily to be eliminated. It is right that whatever is rigorously admissible ought to be retained. There is no alleged deity, not Vishnu, or Krishna, or Heracles, for whom we might not construct a sufficiently reasonable biography by proceeding as has hitherto been done in regard to the legend of Buddha. Under these reserves, I willingly recognize that there remain a certain number of elements which we have no absolute reason for thinking apocryphal. They may represent real historical reminiscences. To that, for my part, I have no objection. It is possible that the founder of Buddhism may have come from a tribe of Sakyas, though the pretended history of that race is certainly quite fictitious. It is possible that he may have come of a royal line, that he may have been born in a city called Kapilavastu, though this name arouses grave suspicions, opening the door to either mythological or allegorical interpretations, and the existence of such a town is very feebly certified. The name Gautama is certainly historic and well known, but it is a borrowed name which tells us little. Much trouble has been taken to explain how this strictly Brahmanic patronymic might have passed to a family of Kshatriyas, the warrior caste. Apart from Buddha, it is above all closely associated with his supposed aunt, the legendary Prajapati. I do not speak of his genealogy. It has certainly no value, being borrowed whole from epic heroes, in particular from Rama. On the other hand, it may well be that the teacher of the Buddhists entered on his religious career at the age of 39, 1285. And so on. Let us pause at the last clause to remember how the Jesus of the Gospels began to be about 30 years of age when he began his teaching career, and to ask on what rational ground we can suppose such a detail to have been biographically preserved when the surrounding narrative yields no sign of biography whatever. There is in fact no single detail in the legend that has any claim to critical acceptance, and the position of the latest conservatives, as Oldenburg, is finally only a general petitio principii. India admits that candid scholar always was, as it is, a land of types, wherein the lack of freedom stunts the free growth of individuality, and in the portraits of the Buddha and all his leading disciples we have simply the same type repeated. Yet, he contends, a figure such as his certainly has not been fundamentally misconceived. Fundamental Missverstanden worden ist ein Gestalt wie die sein Gewiss nicht. 1286 Critical logic will not permit such an a priori reinstatement of a conception in which every element has given way before analysis. It is but an unconscious resort to the old fallacy of meeting the indictment of a spurious document with the formula, who else could have written it? 1287 We recur to the old issue, the thesis that every sect must have had a founder. Such was the unhesitating assumption of Minayev, who did so much to bring historic clearness into early Buddhist history. It is beyond doubt that at the origin of great historic movements always and everywhere appear important and historic personalities. It was so, certainly, in the history of Buddhism, and its development unquestionably commenced in the work of the founder. 1288 Here we have something more than the proposition of M. Senart. We have a doctrine which would ascribe to definite founders the cults of Heracles and Dionysos and Aphrodite, the worship of fire, and the institution of human sacrifice. Dismissing such a generalization as the extravagance of a scholar without sociology, 1289 we bring the issue to a point in the formula of M. Senart. Plainly that is significant in the sense only that someone must have begun the formation of any given group. It is clearly not true in the sense that every sect originates in the new teaching of a remarkable personage. And we have seen reason to infer that there was a group of heretical or deviating Brahmanists, for whom a Buddha was an enlightened one of many, before the quasi-historical Buddha had even so far emerged into personality as the slain Jesus of the Pauline epistles. Brahmanic doctrine, Brahmanic asceticism and vows, and Brahmanic mendicancy, these are the foundations of the order. The personal giver of that rule and teaching, the teaching God, comes later, even as the Jesus who institutes the Holy Supper comes after the Eucharist is an established rite. Every critical scholar, without exception, admits that a vast amount of doctrine ascribed to Buddha was concocted long after his alleged period. It cannot then be proved that any part of the doctrine is not a fictitious ascription, and there is not a single tenable test whereby any can be discriminated as genuine. In the words of Kunan, we are not free to explain Buddhism from the person of the founder, 1290, nor is there any more psychological difficulty in supposing the whole to be doctrinal myth than in conceiving how the later Brahmanists could put their discourses in the mouth of Krishna. The recent attempts to establish the historicity of Gautama Buddha by excavated tomb remains 1291, a kind of evidence which obviously could prove nothing as to the achievements or teaching of the person interred, have broken down on their merits. Dr. Fleet's claim to date an inscribed vase before Asoka's time on the strength of its letter forms is peremptorily rejected, 1292, and Professor David's theory that the remains found under one stupa are those of Buddha has to compete with the theory of Dr. Fleet that they are those of massacred Buddhana Sakya equals kinsman of Buddha, which in turn is rejected by M. Barth as an impossible interpretation. On such lines there can be no establishment of any relevant historic facts, and we are left to the decision that no extant inscription, either in the north or south, can be referred with confidence to a date earlier than that of Asoka. 1293 Professor Kern, coming to conclusions substantially identical with those of M. Senart, posits for us finally an ancient order of monks, absorbing an ancient popular religion, and developing for people of the middle and lower classes the ideals of a spiritual life current in the schools of the Brahmins and the ascetics. It is very possible, he goes on, that the order had been founded, whatever be the precise sense which we attach to that word, by a single man peculiarly gifted, even as, for example, it is possible that Freemasonry may have been so founded. We may even, by an effort of imagination, adorn this founder with all sorts of good qualities, but we have no right to say that the amiability of the Buddha of the legend has any other origin than the antique belief according to which the Buddha, in his quality of cherishing son, is Mano Multisto, 1294, the kindest of men, in the words applied by an old German prayer chant to the deity. This is the warranted attitude of scientific criticism, and the mere, maybe, as to the possible founder is exclusive of any ephemeristic solution. M. Senart's necessary founder, and Professor Kern's possible founder, are wholly remote from the Buddha alike of the Buddhist and of the rationalizing scholar, bent on saving a personality out of a myth. On the face of the case, there is a presumption that, while there may easily have been, about 500 B.C., a man who by his wisdom and his devotion to the spiritual interests of his kind made such an impression that contemporaries compared him to a pre-existing ideal of wisdom and goodness, and that posterity completely identified him with this ideal, 1295 the order was not founded by any such person. No Buddha made the Buddhists made the Buddha. 1296 an obviously sufficient conceptual nucleus for the Buddha lay in the admittedly general Brahmanic notion of Buddhas. There is even a tradition that at the time when Sakyamuni came many men ran through the world saying, I am Buddha. I am Buddha, 1297 This may be either a Buddhist way of putting aside the claims of other Buddhas or a simple avowal of their commonness. But a real Buddha would be a much less likely founder than one found solely in tradition. Any fabulous Buddha as such could figure for any group as its founder to begin with, to him would be ascribed the common ethical code and rules of the group, the clothing of the phantom with the mythic history of Vishnupurusha or Krishna, the Bhagavat of earlier creeds, followed as a matter of course, on the usual lines. M. Senart holds it for established that the legend as a whole was fixed as early as the time of Asoka, 1298 Some of the latest surveys of the problem end in an inference that the oldest elements in the legend consist of fragments of an ancient poem or poems embedded in the Pitakas. 1299 The quasi-biographical color further given to mythical details is on all fours with that of the legends of Joseph, Moses, Joshua, and Jesus, all late products of secondary mythology, in periods which systematically reduced god legends to the biographic level. As we have seen, the fabrication of narrative frames for the teachings ascribed to the Buddha was early an established Buddhist exercise. And this accumulation of quasi-biographical detail, as we have also seen, goes on long after the whole cycle of prior supernaturalist myth has been embodied. It is after Jesus has been deified that he is provided with a mother and a putative father and brothers, and it is in the latest gospel of all that we have some of the most circumstantial details of his life and deportment. There is even a case for the thesis that some of the characteristics of the Buddha are derived from sculptures which followed Greek models. 1300 On these grounds, then, it is here submitted that the traditional figure of the Buddha, in its most plausibly rationalized form, is as unhistoric as the figure of the Gospel Jesus has been separately shown to be. Each figure simply stands for the mythopoeic action of the religious mind in a period in which primary god-making had given way to secondary god-making, and in particular to the craving for a teaching God who should originate religious and moral ideas as the other gods had been held to originate agriculture, art, medicine, normal law, and civilization. And if by many the thought be still found disenchanting, they might do well to reflect that there is a side to the conception that is not devoid of comfort. Buddhism, like Christianity, is from the point of view of its traditional origins a failure. Buddhism, indeed, notably in the case of Burma, has done more to mold the life of a whole people towards its ostensibly highest ethic than Christianity ever did, but Buddhism, being at best a gospel of monasticism, quietism, and mechanical routine, collapsed utterly in India, the land of its rise, and its normal practice savors little of moral or intellectual superiority to any of the creeds around it. 1301 Brahmanism, which seems to have ultimately wrought its overthrow, set up in its place a revived and developed popular polytheism, on the plane of the most ignorant demotic life. Christianity, in turn, professedly the religion of peace and love, is as a system utterly without influence in suppressing war, or interracial malignity, or even social division. The vital curative forces as against those evils are visibly independent of Christianity. And here emerges the element of comfort. On our naturalistic view of the rise of the religions of the secondary or teaching gods, it is sheer human aspiration that has shaped all the Christs and all their doctrines, and one of the very causes of the total miscarriage is just that persistence in crediting the human aspiration to gods and demigods, and representing as superhuman oracles the words of human reason. Unobtrusive men took that course hoping for the best, seeking a short-cut to moral influence, but they erred grievously. So to disguise and denaturalize wise thoughts and humane principles was to keep undeveloped the very reasoning faculty which could best appreciate them. Men taught to bow ethically to a divine teacher are not taught ethically to think. Any aspiration so evoked in them is factitious, vestural, verbal, or at best emotionally superinduced, not reached by authentic thought and experience. When, happily, the nameless thinkers who in all ages have realized and distilled the wisdom or unwisdom given out as divine are recognized in their work for what they were, and their successors succeed in persuading the many to realize for themselves the humanness of all doctrine, the nations may perchance become capable of working out for themselves better gospels than the best of those which turned to naught in their hands while they held them as revelations from the skies. 14. The problem of Manichaeus. On the fringes of the historical problem of Buddhism there lies one which is worth at least a passing scrutiny in this connection, that, namely, of the origins of the heretical quasi-Christian sect of Manichaeans. The Christian tradition runs that one Scythianos, a Saracen, husband of an Egyptian woman, introduced the doctrine of Empedocles and Pythagoras into Christianity, that he had a disciple, Buddhas, formerly named Terebinthus, who travelled in Persia, where he alleged that he had been born of a virgin, and afterwards wrote 4 books, one of mysteries, a second the Gospel, a third the Treasure, and a fourth Heads. While performing some mystic rites, he was hurled down a precipice by a daimon, and killed. A woman at whose house he lodged buried him, took over his property, and bought a boy of 7, named Kubricus. This boy she freed and educated, leaving him the property and books of Buddha's Terebinthus. Kubricus then travelled into Persia, where he took the name of Manes and gave forth the doctrines of Buddha's Terebinthus as his own. The king of Persia, not named, hearing that he worked miracles, sent for him to heal his sick son, and on the child's dying put Manes in prison. Thence he escaped, flying into Mesopotamia, but was traced, captured, and flayed alive by the Persian king's orders, the skin being then stuffed with chaff and hung up before the gate of the city. 1302 For this narrative, the historian Socrates, writing in the 5th century, gives as his authority, the Disputation, with Manes, of Archelaus bishop of Cascar, a work either unknown to or disregarded by Eusebius, who in his history briefly vilifies Manes 1303 without giving any of the above details. In the Chronicon of Eusebius the origin of the sect is placed in the 2nd year of Probus, c. 277, but this passage is probably from the hand of Jerome. 1304 According to Jerome, Archelaus wrote his account of his disputation with Manichaeus in Syriac, whence it was translated into Greek. The Greek is lost, and the work, apart from extracts, subsists only in a Latin translation from the Greek, of doubtful age and fidelity 1305 probably made after the 5th century. By Photius it is stated that Heracleon, bishop of Chalcedon, in his book against the Manichaeans, said that Greek disputation of Archelaus was written by one Hegemonius, an author not otherwise traceable, and of unknown date. In the Latin narrative, Manes is said to have come, after his flight from court, from Arabion, a frontier fortress, to Kaschar or Karchar, a town said to be in Roman Mesopotamia, in the hope of converting an eminent Christian there, named Marcellus, to whom he had sent a letter beginning, Manichaeus, apostle of Jesus Christ, and all the saints and virgins with me, send peace to Marcellus. In his train he brought 22, or 12, youths and virgins. At the request of Marcellus, he debated on religion with Bishop Archelaus, by whom he was vanquished, whereupon he set out to return to Persia. On his way he proposed to debate with a priest at the town of Diodorides, but Archelaus came to take the priest's place, and again defeated him, whereupon, fearing to be given up to the Persians by the Christians, he returned to Arabion. At this stage Archelaus introduces in a discourse to the people his history of Ismanes, very much to the effect of the recapitulation in Socrates. Among the further details are these: 1. That Scythianus lived in the time of the apostles. 2. That Terebinthus said the name of Buddas had been imposed on him. 3. That in the mountains he had been brought up by an angel. 4. That he had been convicted of imposture by a Persian prophet named Parcus, and by Labdacus, son 1306 of Mithra. 5. That in the disputation he taught concerning the sphere, the two luminaries, the transmigration of souls, and the war of the Principia against God. 6. That Corbicius, or Corbicus, about the age of 60, translated the books of Terebinthus. 7. That he made 3 chief disciples, Thomas, Adas, and Hamas, of whom he sent the first to Egypt, and the second to Scythia, keeping the third with him. 8. That the 2 former returned when he was in prison, and that he sent them to procure for him the books of the Christians, which he then studied. According to the Latin narrative, finally, Manes on his return to Arabion was seized and taken to the Persian king, by whose orders he was flayed, his body being left to the birds, and his skin, filled with air, hung at the city gate. That this narrative is historically worthless is admitted by all critical students since Bosoba, and recent historians turn from the Christian to the Oriental accounts of the heresiarch for a credible view. There, Mani is described as a painter, 1307, who set up a sectarian movement in opposition to Zoroastrianism, then in renewed favor in Persia, in the reign of Shapur I. Being proceeded against, he fled to Turkestan, where he made disciples and embellished with paintings a chigil, Chinese name for a temple or picturarum domus, and another temple called Galbita. Provisioning in advance a cave which had a spring, he told his disciples he was going to heaven, and would not return for a year, after which time they were to seek him in the cave in question. They then and there found him, whereupon he showed them an illustrated book, called Ergenk, or Estenk, which he said he had brought from heaven, whereafter he had many followers, with whom he returned to Persia at the death of Shapur. The new king, Hormisdas, joined and protected the sect, and built Mani a castle. The next king, Borom or Varuns, at first favored Mani, but, after getting him to debate with certain Zoroastrian teachers, caused him to be flayed alive, and the skin to be stuffed and hung up as alleged by the Christians. 1308 Thereupon most of his followers fled to India, and some even to China, those remaining being reduced to slavery. In yet another Mohammedan account we have the details that Mani's mother was named Mais or Utakin, or Mar Marjam, Sancta Maria, and that he was supernaturally born. 1309 At the behest of an angel he began his public career, with 2 companions, at the age of 24, on a Sunday, the first day of Nisan, when the sun was in Aries. He travelled for about 40 years, wrote 6 books, and was raised to paradise after being slain under Borom, son of Shapur. Some say he was crucified, in 2 halves, and so hung up at 2 gates, afterwards called High Mani and Low Mani, others that he was imprisoned by Shapur and freed by Borom, others that he died in prison. But he was certainly crucified. 1310 Thus the sole detail which the Mohammedan and Christian writers have in common is that of the execution with its exemplary sequel. Both accounts, it will be observed, make Mani an innovating heretic, but the Persian treats him as inventing his doctrine, while the Christian makes it traditive. The Persian story, however, makes him compose and illustrate his book in Turkestan, with the possible implication that such a book was a novelty in Persia, despite Mani's profession. Bauer and Ninder, accordingly, combining the Christian clue of the name Buddas with the Persian clue to Turkestan, infer that in that territory Mani acquired a knowledge of Buddhism. 1311 To this solution, however, there are several objections. In the first place, there are in Manichaeism only shadowy analogies to Buddhism, and in the second, the name Buddas is plausibly interpreted as being merely a Greek corruption of but more Bud, the Chaldaic name of the terebinth tree, a simple translation of Terebinthus. 1312 On the other hand, Ritter has conjectured that Terebinthus may be a corruption of Buddha's title, Tir Hindu, Lord of the Hindus. Finally, it has to be noted that Herodotus repeatedly mentions a people called the Budini, 1313 among whom were settled the Nuri, who seemed to be magicians, so that Buddhas might be a reminiscence of their repute. We have thus a pleasing variety of choices. 15. The Manichaean solution. Seeking for a solution, we may assume that whatever tradition the Christians had concerning Manes they got from the East, and it is conceivable that from the datum of Turkestan they evolved the ideas of Scythianus and Buddhas, with or without the help of the knowledge that Bud might stand for Terebinthus in Chaldea. 1314 But the Persian tradition in itself has little weight, being merely a way of saying that Mani's doctrine had associations with other lands. On the face of the story, he was heretical before he left Persia, and the medley of theosophic doctrines associated with Manichaeism can be traced on the one hand to the general storehouse of Babylonian law, whence came the law of Christian Gnosticism, and on the other hand to Mazdaism. Such an amalgamation could very well take place on the frontiers of the Persian and Roman empires, early in the Christian era. But it has to be asked how and why Manichaeism, which at so many points resembles the Gnostic systems so-called, should have held its ground as a cult while they were suppressed. Its Jesus and Christ were as far as theirs from conforming to the doctrines of the Church, and it was furiously persecuted for centuries. The explanation apparently lies in the element of cultus, the exaltation of the founder. Was this then a case in which an abnormal teacher really founded a religion by his doctrine and the force of his personality? In order to form an opinion we have first to note two outstanding features of Manichaeism, the doctrine that Manichaeus was the Paraclete, and the fact that his quasi-crucifixion was devoutly commemorated by his devotees in the Bema festival at the season of the Christian Easter. 1315 Concerning the first datum, the most significant consideration is that the equivalent of the names Mani or Manes and Manichaeus is to be explained only on Ussher's theory that they are both variants of an Eastern name equivalent to the Hebrew name Menahem, which has in part the same meaning as Paraclete. 1316 Seeing that Manes is declared to have called himself the Paraclete promised in the Christian Gospel, the question arises whether he was in Syria called Menahem equals Manichaeos on this account, or whether Mani was for Persians, as was Manes or Mane for Greeks and Romans, a parsable equivalent for Menahem, in which the third consonant was a guttural. And seeing that the same name is Graicized as Manin in the Book of Acts, this appears to be the fact. Now, the name Menahem, being framed from the root Nehem, often translated in the Septuagint by, strictly signifies only, the comforter, and has not in Hebrew the various senses of advocate, mediator, messenger, and intercessor, conveyed by Parakletos, but there are some reasons for holding that in post-biblical use it may have had a similar significance with the Greek term. In particular, we find it in late Judaic law practically identified with the title of Messiah, the Messiah ben David being called the Menachem ben Amiel, while the Messiah ben Joseph is named Nehemiah ben Uziel. 1317 The Talmud brings the identification in close touch with Jesuism. Joshua ben Levi saith, his name is Semach, a branch, Zech 3:8. Semach, it will be remembered equals Netzer. Judah bar Ibu saith, his name is Menahem, 1318 Jesus, it will be remembered, becomes the Parakletos in the sense of an intercessor, being yet at the same time an atonement. 1319 And if there is reason to refer the doctrine of the two messiahs to an extra-Judaic source, 1320 a similar surmise is permissible as to the two Menahems. 1321 In this connection we have next to note, as did Bauer long ago, that the story of Mani's concealment in the cave is a strikingly close parallel to the old story in Herodotus concerning the reputed Thracian god Zalmoxis or Zamolxis, of whom some think that he is the same with Gebelizaeus. 1322 Every 5th year they dispatch one of themselves, taken by lot, to Zalmoxis, with orders to let him know on each occasion what they want. Their mode of sending him is this. Some of them are appointed to hold 3 javelins, while others, having taken up the man by the hands and feet, swing him round, and throw him into the air upon the points. If he should die, being transfixed, they think the god is propitious to them. If he should not die, they blame the messenger himself, saying that he is a bad man, and having blamed him they dispatch another. 1323 Gebelizaeus may be the Babylonian fire god Jibal, identified with Nusku. In that case the sacrifice to him of a messenger is one more instance of sacrificing the god to himself, as Jibal-Nusku was the messenger of all the gods. 1324 According to the Greeks of the Hellespont and Pontus, Zalmoxis was a man who had been a slave, at Samos, to Pythagoras, son of Mnesarchus, then was freed, became rich, and retired to his own country, Thrace, where he taught the doctrine of immortality. While teaching this in a dwelling he caused to be built, he in the meantime had an underground dwelling made, and when the building was finished he vanished from among the Thracians, and having gone down to the underground dwelling he abode there 3 years. In the 4th year he reappeared to the Thracians, who had deemed him dead, and thus his teaching became credible to them. 1325 The good Herodotus, neither disbelieving nor entirely believing the legend, was of opinion that this Zalmoxis lived many years before Pythagoras, and we in turn, seeing in the story of the 3 years' stay underground a remote form of the myth of the godman's 3 days in the grave, pronounce that the legends of the freed slave Mani and his concealment in the cave are of similar antiquity. 1326 He is inferably the Menahem or messenger of the cult of the Thracian Gatai, and in another, Scythian, record we have a clue to the legend of his death, as well as to the myth of Scythianus. The flaying of slain enemies was a Scythian usage, and many, having flayed men whole, and stretched the skin on wood, carry it about on horseback. 1327 As with the enemy, so with the messenger. 1328 Whose function is a recognized one in barbaric sacrifice. At the death of a king, they strangled and buried one of his concubines, a cupbearer, a cook, a groom, a page, a courier, and horses, and firstlings of everything else. A year later they strangled 50 of his young men servants and 50 of the finest horses, and, having disemboweled them, stuffed them with chaff and sewed them up. The bodies of the horses were then transfixed lengthwise with beams and placed in the curves of half-wheels to support them. The bodies of the 50 young men were similarly transfixed and mounted on the horses, and the whole ghastly cavalcade was placed around the high place made over the king's grave. 1329 An evolution of such funerary and honorific sacrifices into sacrifices to the gods is in the normal way of religious history. In modern Dahomey, again, it was de rigueur that every occurrence at court should be reported to the spirit of the king's father by a male or female messenger, who was commonly though not always sacrificed. 1330 The Thracian Gatai, who carried on the cult of Zalmoxis and the ritually slain messenger, were subdued by Darius, and embodied in his empire, 1331 with other Scythian tribes, and in that vast aggregate their sacrificial rites had the usual chance of being adopted by their conquerors, if indeed they were not already associated with the worship of Jibal-Nusku the Babylonian fire god, and so known to the Persian fire worshippers. And, whether or not by way of such an adoption, we find that after the death of the captive emperor Valerian his skin was dyed red and stuffed with straw, and was so preserved for centuries in the chief temple of Persia 1332, a course strongly suggestive of religious symbolism. By certain Arab tribes, who worshipped the star Mars, a warrior in blood-stained garments was annually sacrificed by being thrown into a pit, and the god was worshipped in a temple of red color 1333, a kindred conception. Such a proceeding as the Persian, in fact, would have been impossible in a temple without religious precedent, and in the sacrificial practices of the pre-Christian Mexicans, which we find so many reasons for tracing back to an ancient Asiatic center. 1334 we find clear duplicates of both details of the quasi-sacrifice of Valerian, together with the messenger sacrifices of the Khons and Gatai. On the one hand it is recorded that the Mexican Knights of the Sun, on a certain day sacrificed to the sun a human victim whom they smeared all over with some red substance. They sent him to the sun with the message that his knights remained at his service, and gave him infinite thanks for the great favors bestowed on them in the wars. 1335 So, again, in the sacrifice to Xuchitli the fire god in the 10th month the victims were painted red. 1336 On the other hand, in a great annual festival held on the last day of the first month, in which 100 slaves were sacrificed, some were flayed, and their skins were worn in a religious dance by leading devotees, among them being the king. Finally the bodies were sacramentally eaten, and the skins, filled with cotton wool, or straw, were hung in the temple and king's palace for a memorial. 1337 The stuffed skin of the victim, then, was sacrosanct. 1338 And that which had been worn by the king was doubtless specially so, representing as it did at once the deified victim and the monarch. When the king took a captive in war with his own hands, the latter was specially regarded as the representative of the sun, and was clothed with the sun god's royal insignia. 1339 As for the red painting of the messenger sent to the sun, that in turn was presumably a special symbolical identification of the victim with the god, 1340 as in the peculiar Peruvian sacrifice of a shorn sheep, in a red waistcoat, to the sun god at Cusco, 1341, and the final inference is that the dead or slain body of the captive Emperor Valerian was made to figure as a sacrificial special messenger sent by the Persian king to the messenger, sun god, and dedicated to that deity. That the legendary crucifixion of Manichaeus was a myth derived from such a sacrifice is the more probable in view of the evolution of the Christian mystery drama from an analogous rite. 1342 Clemens Alexandrinus, following another authority than Herodotus, tells how a barbarous nation, not cumbered with philosophy, select, it is said, annually an ambassador to the heroes Amolxis, 1343, choosing one held to be of special virtue. The usage would thus seem to have made headway after the time of Herodotus. Clemens, 1344 too, identifies with Zoroaster that son of Armenius who in Plato figures as the messenger from the other world, 1345, having gone thither in a death swoon, a suggestion that at least the Persians now connected the doctrine of immortality with some conception or usage resembling that of the Gatai, and Zoroaster, in turn, was mythically associated with a cave containing flowers and fountains, the whole symbolical of the world, and further associated with resurrection in the mysteries. 1346 Finally, the Manichaeans' annual celebration of the Bema, their name for the rite commemorative of the death of Manichaeus, carries with it no explanation, and must be taken as the title of some Greco-Oriental mystery ritual. The word signifies platform, referring not to the ordinary bema of the Christian churches, wherein stood the altar, but to the covered platform of 5 steps prepared by the Manichaean devotees on the anniversary of the founder's death, 1347, but it is not accounted for by any item in the legendary biography, where no such platform is mentioned. Upon the platform described by Augustine something must have been represented or enacted, and as he appears never to have been one of the electi, but only an auditor or catechumen, he would be, as the Manichaeans declared, unacquainted with the special mysteries of the system. 1348 The 5 steps point to a symbol of the Proto-Chaldean high place or temple pyramid, an altar of sacrifice, often of 5 stages, 1349, and the mystery was in all likelihood akin to the early mystery drama of the Christian crucifixion. The apparent identification of the birthday of Manichaeus, in the late Mohammedan account, with the death day in the known cultus, 1350, and further the symbolism of his public appearance, with 2 others, suggest a mystic scene analogous to the triple crucifixion. In any case, the graded or terraced pyramid, which was at once the norm of a sacrificial altar 1351 and the norm of the temples of Babylonia, Mexico, and the South Sea Islands, was also the norm of regal tombs, as instanced by that of Cyrus, still extant. 1352 The critical presumption, then, is that the flayed and stuffed Manichaeus is one more figure ephemerized out of a rite of annual sacrifice, and that the Manichaean cult is no more the creation of a man named Manes than is the Buddhist the creation of one Buddha, or the Christian of one Jesus called the Christ. It is a syncretism on the lines of those other cults, borrowing ideas from at least 3 theosophic sources, combining a nominal Christism with a modified Mithraism, 1353, and assimilating both, in the doctrine that Jesus hangs on every tree, to the esoteric side of the cult of Dionysos. 1354 The works ascribed to Mani, so far as known, have every mark of being late concoctions, on Gnostic lines, framed for purposes of proselytism in the Christian sphere, each purporting to be written by Manichaeus, an apostle of Jesus Christ, 1355 in the manner of the Christian epistles. The Epistle to the Virgin Menec, of which fragments are preserved by Augustine in the Opus Imperfectum, suggests anew the special signification of the title Manichaeus. As for the Erteng or Erzeng, specially associated in Persia with the name of Mani, the title, it appears, simply means an illustrated book, 1356, and such a book is no more to be supposed primordial in the cult than the epistles. The success of the cult, in fine, was attained very much as was that of Christism. Its promoters, early recognizing the vital importance of organization, created a system of 12 chief apostles or magistri, with a leader, representing the founder, and 72 bishops, 1357, here copying actual Judaism rather than Christian tradition, 1358, and, despite its discouragement of marriage and procreation, it survived centuries of murderous persecution in the Eastern Empire, finally passing on to the West, through the later sects affected by its tradition, the germs of a new heresy in the Middle Ages. Like the crucified Christ, as we have seen reason to think, its founder was an imaginary being, and so it outlasted the tough sects of Marcion and Montanus, of which the latter was all but victorious against orthodoxy. Montanus, says one record, claimed to be inspired by the Paraclete, and his movement, being organized on ecclesiastical lines, went far, beginning in Phrygia, where, as in Persia, the doctrine of a Paraclete was probably pre-Christian. 1359 That Montanus in turn was an imaginary personage is plausibly argued by Schwegler, 1360 but though some of the adherents of the sect seem to have tended to make of him the Paraclete, 1361 it appears to have been a fanatical movement founded on no particular personality, being more commonly named Phrygian than Montanist, from its place of origin, and offering no analogies to Manichaeism save in respect of a general asceticism. Being rather a special development of tendencies already present in the Christian movement than a new creed, it had less lasting power than the other, though its vogue and duration were sufficient to prove how much of what passes for a new religious development special to Christianity was but the exploitation of elements of ecstatic and ascetic fanaticism abundantly present in the old pagan environment, of which Phrygia was a typical part. 1362. 16. The case of Apollonius of Tyana. As regards the historical argument, it may be well, finally, to anticipate an objection which may be grounded on the admission that Apollonius of Tyana, who has been plausibly described as a pagan Christ, 1363 was really a historic personage, though his life is clothed upon with myth from birth to death. Here, it may be argued, was a real man, who had lived in the 1st century of the Christian era, represented in the 3rd as born under supernatural circumstances, working miracles, making disciples and converts by his teaching in Europe and Asia, and finally ascending to heaven. If these prodigies could be told of an actual man, it may be asked, why may not Jesus be actual, of whom similar prodigies are told? The answer is, as aforesaid, that the ascription of prodigies to any ancient personage is not in itself a disproof of his historicity, but that the historical evidence in each case is to be taken on its total merits. It is at bottom the same mythopoeic bias that rings with myth the mere name of a phantom god or demigod and the slightly known life of a remarkable man, and the task of criticism is to distinguish cases by impartial tests. We hold Charlemagne and Theodoric and Virgil for historical, despite the myths connected with them in the Middle Ages. The case of Apollonius belongs broadly to the same class, as perhaps does that of Solomon. It is needless here to remark that the abundant attribution of miracles to Apollonius soon after his own day proves the valuelessness of miracle stories as certificates of divinity. These pages are written for students who have put aside the belief in miracles, and when Christian fathers are found, in the case of Apollonius, attributing to demons the pagan prodigies which they do not deny to have occurred, we have merely to note how absolute was the credulity of the time in regard to any story of strange happenings. They, it is clear, never thought of testing as to whether Apollonius was a real person. They took it for granted that the name of a person said to have existed stood for a real person. Are we, then, entitled to follow their example? The answer is that in the case of Apollonius we have no reason for suspecting invention, 1364 save as regards the details of the biography recast for us by Philostratus in the 3rd century. There even the credible data are uncertain. But it is likely enough that he was, as there represented, a devout Pythagorean, a vegetarian, an ascetic, a student of medicine and astrology, universalist in his creed, and a believer in immortality. And he may conceivably have travelled to India, though the details offered us are naught. 1365 as usual, indeed, there lacks contemporary testimony, apart from that preserved in Philostratus. The life makes Apollonius die about the reign of Nerva, 96 to 98 CE, and our first incidental traces of his fame are in Dio Cassius, 1366 where he is mentioned as a miraculous seer, and in Origen's reply to Celsus, 1367 where one Moiragenes, mentioned by Philostratus, is cited as referring to the accounts of magical feats in the memoirs of Apollonius, and observing that some philosophers of note had been convinced by them. These references belong to the very period of the production of the life by Philostratus, so that there is no trace of any impression previously made by the memoirs of Damis and Maximus of Aegae, declared to be used by him. Still, we have no reason for doubting that there was an Apollonius of Tyana, who made an impression in his own day as a wandering teacher and perhaps as a sorcerer, and whose memory was preserved by statues in several towns, as well as by one or two memoirs, one of them written by his credulous or mendacious disciple, Damis. Of the large number of letters preserved as his, some of them remarkable for their terse force, it is impossible to be sure that they are genuine, though they may very well be so. The reasons for not doubting on the main point are, 1. That there was no cause to be served by fabrication, and 2. That it was a much easier matter to take a known name as a nucleus for a mass of marvels and teachings than to build it up, as the phrase goes about the canon, round a hole. The difference between such a case and those of Jesuism and Buddhism is obvious. In those cases, there was a cultus and an organization to be accounted for, and a biography of the founder had to be forthcoming. In the case of Apollonius, despite the string of marvels attached to his name, there was no cultus. Posterity was interested in him as it was in Pythagoras or Plato, and Philostratus undertook the recasting of the life in literary form at the command of the Empress Julia Domna, a great eclectic. Even if, as has been so often argued, from Huet and Cudworth to Bauer and Greville, 1368 there was an original intention to set off Apollonius against Jesus, we should not have ground to doubt that a teaching Apollonius had flourished in the 1st century, rather the presumption would be that the pagans would seek for some famous wonderworker whose life they could manipulate. But there is really no reason to suppose that Philostratus, much less Dames, had the Gospels before him, though he may well have heard of their story. A close comparison of the story of the raising of Jairus' daughter with the story in Philostratus, to which it is so closely parallel, gives rather reason to believe that the Gospels copied the pagan narrative, the Gospel story being left unmentioned by Arnobius and Lactantius in lists in which they ought to have given it had they known and accepted it. 1369 The story, however, was probably told of other thaumaturgs before Apollonius, and in regard to the series of often strained parallels drawn by Bauer, as by Huet, it may confidently be said that, instead of their exhibiting any calculated attempt to outdo or cap the Gospel narratives, they stand for the general taste of the time in thaumaturgy. Apollonius, like Jesus, casts out devils and heals the sick, and if the life were a parody of the Gospel we should expect him to give sight to the blind. This, however, is not the case, and on the other hand the Gospel story of the healing of 2 blind men is certainly a duplicate of a pagan record. 1370 to say, as does Bauer, that the casting out of devils in the Apollonian legend is necessarily an echo of the Gospels, on the score that the Greek and Roman literatures at that time show no traces of the idea. 1371 is to make the arbitrary assumption that the superstitions of Syria could enter the West only by Judaic or Christian channels. The Metamorphoses of Apuleius, to say nothing of those of Ovid, might serve to remind us that the empire imbibed the diablerie of the East at every pore, and the wizardry of Apollonius includes many Eastern items of which the Gospels show no trace. As for the enunciation of the birth of Apollonius by Proteus, and the manner of its happening, they conform alike to Egyptian myths and to that told concerning the birth of Plato. 1372 it is, in fact, the Christian myth that draws upon the common store of Greek and Syrian myth, not the Apollonian legend that borrows from the Christian. The descent of Apollonius to Hades, again, seems to have been alleged, after common Greco-Asiatic precedent, before the same myth became part of the Christian dogmatic code, and to say that his final disappearance without dying and his apparition afterwards must have been motived by the story of Christ's appearing to Saul 1373 is once more to ignore the whole lesson of comparative hierology. Bauer goes so far as to argue 1374 that when Philostratus says the disciples of Apollonius in Greece were called Apollonians, he must be merely framing a parallel to the title of the Christians, because there is now no knowledge of a sect of Apollonians. It was very hard, 2 generations ago, for even a great scholar to realize the broadest laws of religious evolution. Yet Lardner had shown with reasonable force, in his primitive fashion, nearly a century before, that the model before Philostratus, if there be any, is not Jesus but Pythagoras. 1375 and his friend de la Roche had rightly and tersely summed up the whole case in the words, Philostratus said nothing more in the life of Apollonius than he would have said if there had been no Christians in the world. 1376 For once, Bauer had not fully grappled with the literature of his subject. 1377 His superiority to his Christian predecessors as a critic of Apollonius comes out chiefly in his gravely candid recognition 1378 of the high moral purpose set forth in all the discourses ascribed to the hero in the life. The habit of pitting Apollonius against Jesus really arose about a century after Philostratus, when the pagan intelligence first began to feel itself menaced by the new creed. Hierocles set the fashion in his Philoleths Logos, to which Eusebius and Lactantius 1379 replied in the normal patristic manner. 100 years later still, in the time of Augustine, The setting of the miracles of Apollonius and Apelles against those of Jesus was a common line of pagan argument. 1380 met in the usual way, neither side convincing the other. If there was any gain, it was on the pagan side, for while Chrysostom 1381 triumphs over the failure of the Apollonian movement, such a classically cultured Christian bishop as Sidonius Apollinaris 1382 acclaims the personal virtues and philosophic teaching of the pagan sage. The pagans on their part had taken him up all round. In the day of Philostratus, Alexander Severus had eclectically placed a bust of Apollonius, with others of Abraham, Jesus, and Orpheus, in his private chapel or oratory. 1383, and later we find Eunapius, 1384 Ammianus Marcellinus, 1385 Vopiscus, 1386 and Apelles, 1387 from their different standpoints treating the Tyanean as a demigod, or divinely inspired, or a supreme mage. It was not, of course, the high ethic and philosophy of the Apollonian discourses that they stressed as against the Christians. Such a saying as, "I have found my reward in the amendment of men," 1388 was not a word to conjure with in popular debate. It was the miracles, the prodigies, the fables, that were for ancient readers the warrant of the sage's greatness. Today we cannot tell any more than they to what extent the remarkable discourses which Philostratus professes to copy from Damis stand for any genuine utterances or writings of Apollonius. 1389 We can be satisfied of the historicity of the man without knowing how far to trust the accounts of his travels and teaching. But we know that if Apollonius had uttered every wise or eloquent teaching put in his mouth by his biographers, he could not thereby have founded such a cult as the Christians conducted on the basis of an entirely fictitious biography. Lactantius, in the patristic style, asks Hierocles, "Why therefore, O mad head, doth none worship Apollonius for a god, unless perchance thou alone, worthy indeed of that god, with whom the true God will punish thee to all eternity?" 1390 We today can give the answer of hierology. No man was ever perdurably deified for his wisdom, or even for his supposed miracles. Religions grow up around rites offered immemorially to unknown powers, or round ways of life set up by generations of nameless teachers, all of which abstractions alike take form as named gods or sons of gods, who in one age are the givers of civilization, agriculture, knowledge, crafts, arts, rites, and laws, and in another of oracles, of revelations, of doctrines and discourses, of their own lives as redeemers. But the really slain man, the true human sacrifice, though he be counted by millions, is not deified, not he, but an abstraction shaped out of the mystic drama and sacrament which have followed on ages of sacrifices and sacraments of human flesh, and neither is the true teacher or thinker deified, not he, but a superposed abstraction distilled from many teachings, wise or unwise, put by many generations in the mouth of the mythical one. For it is by such modes alone that men have been able to create the economic basis without which no religion can live. Apollonius, credited with many miracles and wondrous wisdom, like Pythagoras long before him, could become a god only by way of a passing figure of speech, precisely because he had really lived and taught. Given the culture stage in which many crave the teaching god, while the multitude still crave the sacrificed god, a cult which shall combine these in one deity, still retaining the cosmic creator god and adding the attractive appeal of the mother goddess, has obviously a maximum chance of survival. And such a religion, we have seen reason to conclude, cannot be founded on concrete personages, it must be developed from personalized abstractions. Such a combination is presented in the Christian cultus. But all such success is finally in terms of political and economic adaptations, and the final explanation of non-survivals, accordingly, is to be found in the lack or frustration of such adaptations. It remains to note, then, how systems historically developed from abstractions like the Christian have disappeared in the struggle for existence. Part 3. Mithraism.